I want to talk about constraints because there's this sort of general idea about constraints that we have that they are a negative thing. You know, there's stuff that limits freedom. And of course, you know, limiting freedom, that sounds like a bad thing. I don't want that. But I would like to show you how constraints can be extremely good and even beautiful if we embrace them in the right way. Because constraints are everywhere. They literally are everywhere. They are in the rooms that we live and work in. They're the streets that we drive on, the clothes on our backs, they're the balances in our bank accounts, they're the hotels that we attend conferences in, the stages we present from. Yeah, this is a constraint. Our entire our entire society is built on a set of legal constraints which give us morality and stability and safety and security. And those in turn provide us with freedom and opportunities for us to pursue things that we want. Things like careers and dreams and just hobbies or whatever you want to do. Constraints are a really inherent part of the universe and life itself. I mean, death is the constraint that gives meaning to life. But I'll spare you philosophical debate. Certainly at 10:30 a.m. But yeah, so constraints are everywhere. So are they just bad, are they just good, or are they really, you know, kind of both, perhaps? In this case, this man is Gary Chang. He's a Hong Kong-based architect, and he had a constraint of his apartment of 32 square meters, which is about 345 square foot, which is about maybe twice the size of this stage, and that's it. That was his apartment, and he grew up in that. But he wanted to have a nicer, sort of like more roomy place to live in. And so what he did was, he took that constraint of his physical space, and he turned it into something amazing by making all of the interior walls adjustable, so that he could have a really nice, spacious, comfortable bedroom. And then he could just pull the bed up, pull a different wall out, and now he would have a living room. Or he could pull the wall a little bit further, now he'd have a library room for reading. You can see in the bottom three screenshots from a video what he's doing with the walls. He's pulling them out, turning them into other rooms, basically. It has a kitchen. He just pulls a wall out. Here's a nice big kitchen. There's a bathtub underneath the kitchen, so he has a whole bathroom. And he took these physical constraints and turned them into something really just creative and amazing. Like, I don't necessarily want to live in Hong Kong, but I would want to live in that apartment, at least for a little bit, right? But he wasn't even the first to do adjustable interiors. In 1924, the Dutch designer and architect Gerrit Rietveld designed, he was commissioned to do a design for a house. And the woman who commissioned him, she requested that he design it preferably without walls. Now, how do you design a house preferably without walls, right? So he went through some design phases and ended up with this fantastic house that's sort of where the interior bleeds out into the exterior. And the interior is completely adjustable into different size bedrooms and kitchen and living room. And this was a really unusual constraint for him to work in, but it turned out that this constraint produced or led him to create this incredibly creative but also hyper-modern house. Because we look at this and we kind of see, oh, you know, this might have been designed and built somewhere in the last 20 years. It has a modern feel to it, but this is almost 90 years old. This was way ahead of its time. And that's just because he was forced to think in a completely different way, where he could not build on any of the architectural styles that had come before. There was nothing in the history of architecture that he could sort of learn from about how to do such a completely different style of house. Now, we also have financial constraints. I mean, who doesn't work with a limited budget? And for this sommelier, the design firm was told, you know, there's only a very small budget available for this. I just want a brand identity, but I don't have a lot of money. Turns out that was okay. They came up with this really great creative solution where they took vanilla business cards and envelopes and just put wine stains all over them. This was a very cheap solution, but it is such a, I like it so much because every card and every envelope is unique. No two are alike, but you hold two up next to each other and you can just tell this is a brand, this is an identity that really works for her. You know, and that's a financial constraint that drove them to do something nice and creative and beautiful. We can also have arbitrary constraints in our work or in the things that we create. For instance, Instagram was originally built as just an iPhone app. And the iPhone at the time, and not anymore with the 5, but at the time was a 3:2 screen, aspect ratio. The photos it took were 3:2, more or less. But they decided to go with a fixed size for their photos because they wanted to sort of reminisce from the Polaroid era. Now, they did a bunch of other stuff as well, so they didn't need to necessarily go with the fixed photo size. They could have just gone with like, hey, these are the filters, this is like the little Polaroid frame around it. It would still look like Polaroids, even if it was a different, a higher resolution photo or different aspect ratio. But they went with the fixed size, and that resulted in this unique sort of like identity for them, which we now associate with them as much as we do with Polaroid. More so with Polaroid if you're older, less so if you're younger. And these were completely arbitrary constraints. There were no technical reasons for them to do this. They had all the freedom they wanted in terms of whatever this would be like. They chose to force themselves into this square constraint. And I would say it worked out pretty well for them. Now, nature has constraints. I'm going to read this quote by Rob Dunn. Trees have evolved in the struggle of plant against plant many times. In vastly different lineages, the highest leaves win, and so trees tend to evolve to be as tall as possible, given the limits of physics and precipitation. Without competition, every forest would be a thick film of green life. Now, imagine for a moment that nature didn't have this constraint of physics and precipitation and sunlight, and the Earth would be covered in just thick films of green life all over. The breadth of nature's wonder would not be here today. We would not even have life on Earth the way we know it. I found it so beautiful that there are so many constraints in the world and in nature that when you just look at them, you see that nature will find a way. Life finds a way around these constraints to either work within them or to work around them. But it finds some sort of creative solution. But what I'm not saying is that you need constraints for creativity. That's not what I'm saying. It fosters creativity, but it's not dependent on it. For instance, who's familiar with this building? Okay, so you've probably heard of this. This is the Sagrada Familia, the cathedral designed by Gaudi in Barcelona. And this is, in my opinion, one of the most amazing pieces of art ever created in the history of mankind. This cathedral is amazing. It is jaw-droppingly stunning. As you walk through it, you find endless amounts of little details in every part of this really gigantic, beautiful cathedral. It is really incredibly beautiful. It's awe-inspiring. And it's not done yet. They started in 1892. Gaudi died before it was even halfway completed. And it's not even done for another 20 years. So while this is a great testimony to the limitless potential of the human mind if we have all the freedom in the world and no constraints, deadlines have their uses. Because we cannot just always do something like this. Certainly not if we want to see the end result of our work before we die. So some constraints probably useful for us, specifically deadlines. Another constraint in life is the human attention span, which is about 15 to 20 minutes. So I want to take a brief moment of Zen to breathe in and kind of reflect. We've seen that constraints can produce really good things. They can be really beautiful. The results can be stunning. We can find a lot of creativity and innovation as a result of them. So what if we want to apply this to our work? Of course we have constraints in our work. I mean, we work in a digital media, so we don't have natural constraints. We don't have natural resources that are limited for us to worry about so much. The interfaces we design, the code that we write, we can basically go on endlessly with those. But we do have certain constraints in our work, and some of us work better with them than others. Certain techniques work better than others. Take, for instance, screen sizes. Now, since the advent of the graphical interface, we've always kind of had essentially this limited canvas for the screens that we work with. I mean, there's a screen size limit of the monitor or the display that we're looking at, but behind that, the interface that we're looking at is essentially a limitless canvas. It can be endless in any direction, except that would be a really bad experience. So we say, okay, well, we'll make some of it constrained. But then, of course, not all the information fits, so we have scrolling. And with scrolling, we kind of realized that, you know what, scrolling back and forth and sideways in all directions, that's kind of a painful experience. You know, that doesn't work very well. So we kind of said, let's decide to make scrolling go vertical only. You know? For the most part, we did. And then we decided at some point collectively that 980 pixels was a great width for websites. Why? Because the dominant screen size at the time just happened to be a certain slightly over 980 pixels width. But that was not really a constraint of the medium. And when mobile devices started coming around, we started having all these smartphones and then later tablets, we kind of very, very quickly realized that that 980 pixel width constraint that we had self-imposed really didn't make any sense, because now we had all these different devices with different screen sizes that just didn't fit that, and it was just a bad experience, so we had to come up with mobile sites, and that was not really working very well. And so we had responsive web design come up, or, you know, Ethan Marcotte came up with responsive web design. And he gave us a new constraint. And he said, enough of the mobile sites and the desktop sites and all these weird things we do trying to cater to all these various different screen sizes. I kind of envision him as like, you know, maybe Gandalf, and like, enough! And he gave us a new constraint, one that I really like. Content should exist at one URL and should work on whatever device or screen size is reading that content. I love that. It's very fitting for the nature of our platform or of our medium of the internet, of the web. And so that became a really sort of positive embrace of constraints, ditching the ones that we self-imposed that didn't make a lot of sense. And we see a really good result, despite what some idiots might try and convince you of. Responsive web design is a really effective way of building, designing the absolute next generation of websites and web applications that we're making now. Except, you know, we're not quite there yet. The technology isn't entirely there yet. But also, we've started to design for various screen sizes. We've done that. Now we have, okay, we're designing for mobile first, and then we're expanding to tablets, and then expanding to desktops, and it's a nicer and richer experience. But one of the things that we see happening in the code still is that we're coding these websites as if everyone is actually on a desktop and has broadband data and no data, like no limited data use. So now we're seeing responsive websites that look great on mobile, but send 4 megabytes of data to this small device that's on 3G and might only have like 500 megs of data for a month. So there's still some code constraints that we haven't really embraced properly yet. And I think that's kind of a shame because code constraints are really great. In fact, they're so great that there's contests about them. Who has heard of the 10K apart? Who's heard of 5K? I feel like I'm the old one now. 5K was this code constraint contest done by Stuart Butterfield in 2001 and 2002. And what this contest was all about, he challenged web developers to make something. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, didn't matter what, whatever they wanted. But the entire amount of data that their website or mini application was had to be 5 kilobytes or less. 5 kilobytes. Now this was 2002, so we're already seeing some cool stuff happening in web size or web page sizes grow a little. So 5K was just crazy. Except in that craziness, there was something really appealing to a lot of people because they came up with all these really creative solutions to work within those constraints. There were people who created sort of generated interfaces by using JavaScript to generate the next lines of code automatically that would then create the interface for it so that it all fit within 5K of data, even though once you ran it in the browser, it would be a lot more. And we had all these crazy things happening, and it was such a success that he did it 2 years more. And then after that, about 8 years later, A List Apart looked at it and was like, we should do this again. All these page sizes are ballooning and people aren't really, they're sort of taking a lazy way out. They're just throwing library after library after library in there, and it's not the best. And we have this responsive web design happening right now, and we need to promote that. So they created 10K Apart. And 10K Apart is a contest where you have not 5 kilobytes, but you have 10 kilobytes. Yes, twice as much. And you had the permission of using 1 or 2 JavaScript libraries here and there. You had a little bit of extra help, stuff that you could use that wouldn't count against those 10 kilobytes. And then with that, what we ended up seeing from that was people made entire websites, entire web applications, and little games in the browser using just 10 kilobytes of code. And they worked on smartphones and tablets and desktop, all within 10K of code. So this crazy constraint ended up leading to so much creativity and so much sort of code innovation that we now have fantastic results from it. And Stuart had this great quote about it, saying, rigid constraints of designing for the web force us to get truly creative. Since the space we have to explore is so small, we have to look harder, get more creative, and that's what makes it all interesting. And I could not agree more with this. The results of the 10K Apart in particular have just blown me away. The things people have been doing with 10K of code. Now, a similar project around that time was Dave Shea's CSS and Garden. And it had also a code-related constraint. It was a little different. It said, this is the HTML page, or XHTML page in that time. You do not get to change this code. You do not get to change the markup. This is it. Work with this. All you get to do is provide it a new CSS file. And what we ended up seeing from that constraint led to people designing more than 1,200 completely unique designs for one single HTML page. And they were extremely diverse. Some of them were just so completely different from what you would expect if you look at the site and the default templates, the kind of the examples that Dave provided. Some of them are so different that if you were opening them in one browser, they look completely different than another to showcase the different capabilities of browsers and how CSS works. And this was really important because for our industry, at the time the CSS and Garden came around, CSS as a method of styling websites and designing them was heavily under dispute. There were a lot of people who were like, no, tables are fine. No, this CSS stuff just doesn't work. It's crazy. Go away. But the CSS and Garden proved that CSS was not just here to stay. It was so fantastic for styling websites. It offered you so much more flexibility than you ever could achieve with tables. And this was really pivotal for our industry. And it all came down to one constraint. This is the XHTML page. You do not get to change it. It also really taught people about the separation of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is a constraint of its own. Because before that, we kind of messed everything up by putting it all together. And what we had with that was really just messy code that was really hard to work with later on. So with the separation, we got this really clean code. It was much more maintainable, worked better. Basically meant you weren't a dick to anyone using your code in the future, including your own future self. And we had this, this whole separation thing that it kind of became a much more successful technique for people to work with. We also have, now we have mobile constraints, resource constraints, where we may have smartphones with resolutions on their screens that rival our desktop laptops and desktop screens, perhaps, but they're running on smaller devices with less resources, less memory, less CPU power, and also less bandwidth power. The average mobile, it's not like, yeah, you have 3G and now you have LTE. It's sort of great, but for the most part in the world, it's more like the crappy Wi-Fi at a coffee shop full of hipsters. It's really not that great. And if your page works great on desktop because your desktop is connected to broadband and has a great connection, doesn't necessarily mean that person on mobile is getting that 3 megabyte page that you've created about as fast. So we need to sort of keep that size constraint in check. Now, Modernizer, which I hope everyone's familiar with, but in designing Modernizer, I set a very clear set of API constraints that I imposed on how it had to work. It was very simple. It had to be very easy to use an if-else in your JavaScript. And just say, hey, if the browser supports this feature, then do this. If it doesn't support this feature, then do that. And it had to work the exact same way in CSS. You had to be able to say in your CSS, if the browser supports this feature, use this CSS. If it doesn't, use that CSS. And that API constraint, the very simple use case, meant that Modernizer was really easy to use and really powerful to use, and now used very widely by lots and lots of people. It also had size constraints. It had to be very small. The footprint had to be small so that it would download really fast, because we had the HTML5 shiv in there, so that IE browsers that didn't yet support the new HTML5 semantic elements would still be able to understand them and style them before the page started rendering and looked like shit. So we had the size constraint, which tied into the speed constraint. It had to execute and be done in less than 50 milliseconds, because otherwise you had a good chance of seeing this flash of weird, unstyled content happen. So we imposed all these sort of restraints on them, and nowadays, you can add all the tests you want to Modernize. It's not under 50 milliseconds anymore, but for production, you only use what you need. It's still pretty much underneath that, or even far less. And these constraints that we imposed, we didn't have to. I mean, with JavaScript libraries these days, you can just kind of go do whatever you want. Not that you should, but we imposed these constraints on it, and they worked really well. And that leads me to looking forward. There's a pattern emerging in our industry of opinionated interfaces, and I'm not talking about HAL, though I do kind of like the idea of HAL as just an opinionated interface. But what I'm talking about is the default settings and the features that we offer. Most users don't change defaults. And most users will take features for granted if you put them in front of them. But what that means is every setting that you create and every default you choose for that basically dictates the behavior and the experience of your users. And if you impose certain limitations, they can turn into really great liberations. If you have a feature, the user has to interact with that. or they don't have to, but they'll be aware of that, and they have to think about it. If you take that feature away, you free up the cognitive load for that user, allowing them to focus on the things that they probably should be working on instead. That's not true for every feature, of course. Certain features are really critical. Others are sort of like nice for a small amount of people. A good example of that is PowerPoint and Keynote. You know, these slideshow software tools. The first thing they ask the user is, you know, what pixel dimensions do you want your slides to be in? Who cares? Right? I don't care. This is a projector. This is a rectangle. My slides, rectangle. Should fit. But they have this feature in there for, you know, maybe the 1% or 0.1% of users that actually use it. They have a need for it. So there's some people that really do need that feature. But most people, they have no need for that. They just want it to work. They should be focusing on whatever presentation they're about to create. And so it's adding cognitive load to their experience that should not be there. Now, the tool I'm creating, Presentate, we kind of make it opinionated and just say, your slides, this is the aspect ratio, go focus on your story, go focus on whatever you're talking about, focus on your content. Because we believe that slides should exist in all dimensions, or all pixel dimensions, you know, not time and space. And so what we do is we just say, hey, these are your slides, and if you're opening them on a really small phone, they'll fit nicely on the phone. If you're opening them on a tablet, they'll fit nicely in the tablet. Opening on a desktop, they'll fit nicely on the desktop. These are all various sizes for the exact same slides. And that's how it should be. You shouldn't be having to think about the size of your slides. That's a feature that should be embedded in the product, and the product should be opinionated about that. It should make that decision for you, and in some cases, certainly in this case, it should not even like tell you about that decision. That should just be ingrained in the product. That's a form of constraint. Of course, just having missing features or hidden features in your product or interface doesn't mean it is opinionated. And I define it as such, that the difference between a bad interface and an opinionated interface is that in the latter, missing features are by design. You have to think about really whether these features that you're putting in your tool, your website, your interface, whether they are necessary for the user to spend time thinking about. There's a good chance that maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if you do hide them, you need to, this needs to be a designed and an informed decision to make that. So I want to leave you with the encouragement to think about the size and efficiency and the use of your code the way Gary Chang did with his apartment, or Rietveld with the house. I want you to think about the code reuse and the reusability of resources, like the sommelier's case with the design branding for with wine. I want you to think about imposing arbitrary constraints on your app or your website, and think about what the defaults mean for your users and what kind of experience they really dictate for your users. And think about creating opinionated software. And hopefully, we'll see some really nicely constrained but beautiful products as a result. Thank you very much.